What does silence sound like at 30 below zero? Not peaceful silence, but the kind that waits outside a cabin wall while the fire burns low, the kind that makes closing your eyes feel like a risk. Tonight, we are not following gunfights or gold strikes. We are entering a quieter frontier story, one told in frost, darkness, and the long effort of making it through the night. Out there, sleep was never simple comfort. It was a fragile skill, learned against wind, cold, and fear. In the winter Wild West, darkness was not empty. It pressed against rough walls, moved through roof seams, whispered beneath doors, and reminded every tired body that rest could never be taken for granted. To lie down was to trust thin shelter, fading embers, and your own exhausted heart. Yet people did it anyway, again and again, through nights that must have felt far longer than the clock could measure. And that is the question waiting for us here, not only how people survived those winters, but how they surrendered to sleep inside them. And because we are only visitors to that cold, we can step into it slowly, from a place of warmth and safety. So let the room grow quieter now, let the day loosen its grip, and follow this story backward into a softer, older century. So for a little while, there is nothing you need to do except listen, and even that can be gentle. You do not have to hold every detail in place. This is a slow walk through history, not a hurried one. We are only letting the mind grow quieter, as if drawing a little closer to a hearth while the night settles outside. We will wander through this older world softly, not to chase action, but to rest inside atmosphere, habits, and small human endurance. What follows is less a tale of events than a quiet study of how ordinary people found sleep against extraordinary cold. So let the story move around you rather than press on you. Let it come like low firelight, like distant wind, like a voice that does not ask to be hurried. There is no need to keep every detail tightly in mind. The night can hold some of them for you, and now, from this calm place, let us drift somewhere more specific. Wyoming, winter, the early 1870s. Wyoming, winter, the early 1870s. Out on the plains, the world seems pared down to a few pale things: snow, sky, wind, and distance. The sky is a faded sheet of white, so thin and colorless, it seems to give almost nothing back to the earth below. Snow falls in a patient, steady way, not dramatic, only constant enough to soften every edge and quiet every sound. There are no bright windows ahead, no lamps along a road, no sense of a town waiting just over the next rise. There is only open country and the long cold reach of evening. Somewhere in that wide emptiness stands a cabin, small enough to miss if you were not looking for it, and far enough from the nearest settlement that night makes it feel completely alone. By dusk, distance grows heavier. Help is too far away to belong to this hour. The road has nearly vanished under snow. The horizon has thinned until land and sky seem to blur together in one muted field of white and grey. And there you are, not in a grand adventure, but at the simple edge of another winter evening. The shelter before you is rough and narrow, built more from need than certainty, the sort of place that promises little beyond a roof, a wall, and a chance. It does not look powerful against the weather. It only looks stubborn, but sometimes stubborn is enough, because tonight's goal is very small. Not comfort, only this: to get through the dark, to sleep for a few hours, to open your eyes again when morning comes, and to go on. On the winter frontier, even a simple night of sleep could feel like a negotiation with morning. And still, the scene has its own hush, snow gathering softly, the last of the light draining from the plains, a single shelter holding its place while the wind moves around it. Lonely, yes, but quiet too, so let us come closer now. Leave the wide whitening land behind, step up to the cabin wall, and move inside, where the night narrows into one room, and the small human work of trying to rest. Inside, the cabin is smaller than the open plains made you expect. The wide cold of the landscape has narrowed into one dim room, and everything in it seems shaped by urgency rather than comfort. This was not a house built slowly by craftsmen with time to spare. It was a shelter, raised as quickly as possible before the season turned hard. Rough logs, unevenly cut, mud pressed into the seams, moss, cloth, and whatever else could be pushed into the gaps to slow the wind a little. From the outside, it may have looked settled enough. From the inside, the weaknesses could be felt. The walls do not fully hold, here and there. Thin drafts move through the room with quiet determination, touching a cheek, slipping past a sleeve, finding the small spaces left unguarded. The roof above is sod, laid over rough boards, practical more than reliable. In winter, it carries snow, dampness, and a constant sense of strain. A little moisture may gather overhead, a little cold may linger there, all day and all night. There is a window, perhaps only one, but no real glass. Instead, there is oiled paper stretched over a frame, enough to turn daylight into a pale blur. Enough to remind you after dark how thin the boundary is between this room and the frozen world outside. Even the floor offers little comfort. If there are planks, they are rough and imperfect. If there are not, then the earth itself lies just beneath you. Either way, cold rises, it comes upward through seams and boards and settles low in the room, so that a person standing still might feel the chill gathering first around the boots, then the ankles, then the whole lower half of the body. And there, against one wall or near the hearth, if the room allows it, is the room allows it. Bed. Bed is a generous word for it, though it is the word people use. A plain wooden frame, ropes pulled across it, over those ropes, a thin tick stuffed with straw or dried grass, saved from the warmer months. By winter, it is flattened under use. The stuffing has shifted and settled. Stems press through in small, stubborn ways. Beneath the body there is give. But not much. Rest here begins with hardness. Then come the coverings, heavy wool blankets, useful but scratchy, holding warmth if they can, holding dampness too. They smell faintly of smoke, of breath, of the room itself. If a family is fortunate, there may also be a buffalo robe. Dense and weighty, not pretty, but valuable in the only way that matters on such nights. It keeps heat near the body a little longer. For many frontier people, the bed was not a place where comfort began, but a place where endurance began. And still, by nightfall, this poor bed gathered meaning. The rope frame, the flattened straw, the coarse wool, the robe if one was lucky enough to have it. All of it became a small promise that effort might stop for a little while. Not beautifully, not deeply, but long enough for the body to loosen its grip on the day. And before that could happen, there were the evening rituals, quiet and necessary, that had to be done before anyone could even think of lying down. By late afternoon the day was already slipping away. Winter light did not linger long on the plains. It thinned early, faded early, and left the cabin standing in a dimness that felt like a warning. This was the hour when every movement began to point toward the same small purpose, preparing for the night. The fire came first. It always did. Firewood had been cut, carried, stacked, and protected as carefully as food. None of it could be spent carelessly, so the evening fire was fed in measured pieces, never in comfort, always in calculation. Enough to lift the chill a little, enough to warm a pot, enough to keep the room from turning hostile too soon. Not enough to forget tomorrow. A supper might be set over the flame, thin broth, beans, a little salt pork, if there was any to spare. It was not a meal to linger over, only one to warm the hands and quiet the body before darkness settled fully in. A person ate close to the hearth, feeling heat on the face while the back stayed cold. That unevenness was part of winter life. Warmth rarely reached the whole body at once. After that came the quiet checking of things. The door was tested against the wind, the latch, the frame, the thin places where air might slip through. Boots were turned toward the hearth, near enough to soften by morning, but not so near that the leather would crack or burn. Tomorrow's clothes were laid where they might catch a little leftover warmth, or at least avoid the worst of the night's cold. None of this was dramatic. That was exactly why it mattered. The same acts, evening after evening, until survival began to feel like ritual. Then the coals had to be banked. Ash was drawn over them. The fire was settled inward. Perhaps one more stick of wood was laid across in hope that a little heat might still be alive by dawn. If this was done well, the morning would begin with embers instead of grey dead ash. If it was done badly, the whole day would begin in harder cold. Out here, sleep was never the end of the day. It was the final task of the day. And yet, there was something almost soothing in the order of it. The bowl near the fire, the boots in their place, the door checked once more, the clothes folded for morning, the careful tending of coals. Each act was small. Together they made the night feel slightly less uncertain, slightly more bearable. And when nothing else could be done, when the wood had been measured, the broth finished, and the room arranged as well as it ever would be, there remained only one thing left: to go to the bed itself, and let all that preparation meet the shock of cold cloth and colder air. And so, at last, there was nothing left to arrange. The fire had been measured out as carefully as it could be. The door had been checked, the boots and clothes were waiting for morning, only the bed remained. It was cold before you touched it. Cold in the blankets, cold in the straw tick, cold in the narrow strip of air trapped just above it. No one sensible undressed for such a night. You lay down in your wool clothes, in thick socks, sometimes with your coat still on, sometimes with a cap pulled low over your ears. Whatever warmth you had managed to keep in your body through the evening had to be guarded now, not given away. The first moment under the covers was often the hardest. The cloth did not welcome you. It took your shape reluctantly. The mattress beneath felt stiff and uneven, the ropes below it firm, the whole bed holding the chill it had gathered all day in the dim room. For a few moments, it could feel as though you had climbed not into rest, but into another layer of winter. So the body answered the only way it knew. It curled inward, knees drew up, shoulders rounded, hands disappeared under the arms, or tucked between the thighs, wherever a little borrowed warmth might be found. The blankets were pulled high, sometimes almost to the eyes, until only a small part of the face remained in the open air. Breath rose and faded there, a faint white bloom in the darkness. Then another, each one briefly visible before it vanished into the room. You did not stretch out the way a warm sleeper might. You made yourself smaller. Smaller meant warmer, smaller meant safer. The night taught its own geometry, and then, once the first shock had passed, there came the long listening. The wind was seldom absent. It moved around the cabin with a low, patient voice, sometimes whispering at the seams, sometimes pressing harder until the whole structure seemed to answer it. Wood shrank in the cold, and gave off small sounds of strain. A sharp tick from the wall, a faint groan from the roof. Somewhere inside the room, or behind it, mice made their tiny scratchings as they searched for crumbs, or warmth, or simply another place to survive until morning. Farther out, beyond the thin boundary of the walls, there might be the call of coyotes, or wolves speaking to one another over the snow, and once in a while, on some more distant ridge or dark stretch of land, a sound stranger and lonelier than the rest, the harsh cry of a mountain lion, carrying through the night before silence took it back. All of it entered the bed with you, not the animals themselves, not the weather itself, but the knowledge of them. The awareness, the sense that sleep out here was never complete forgetting. Frontier sleep was rarely full surrender. Some part of the body stayed listening all night long. And yet, even that listening changed as the hours passed. A sound repeated, often enough could lose its edge. The wind became less a threat than a presence. The creak of timber, the hush at the wall, the faint movements in the dark all began to settle into a pattern. Not comforting exactly, but familiar enough that the mind, worn down by labor and darkness, could begin to loosen. Familiar enough that danger itself, held at a distance, might blur into rhythm. And so one sleeper, drawn tight beneath rough blankets in one small cabin, might slowly drift toward a broken kind of rest, not deep, not careless, but enough, and beyond that single bed. Across the frontier, others were trying to do the same in their own ways, in cabins, bunkhouses, camps, and open country, each body making its own uneasy bargain with the winter night. Across the frontier, that effort to sleep took more than one form. The cabin bed was only one version of the night. Beyond it were other rooms, other shelters, other arrangements made between cold, exhaustion, and the body's need to rest. In a family cabin, no one slept very far from anyone else. The room was too small for distance. Children might be tucked into corners beneath quilts that had already grown thin from use, or laid on pallets close to the hearth where a little warmth still lingered in the floorboards. A mother might wake half a dozen times without fully waking at all, listening for a child's cough, pulling a blanket higher, reaching out in the dark to feel whether small feet were still warm. Husbands and wives slept close, not for romance exactly, but for heat. Shared warmth was practical. A body beside you could matter as much as another blanket. And yet, there was tenderness in it too, in the quiet nearness, in the simple fact of breathing through the same hard night together. Elsewhere, in mining camps, railroad quarters, and cattle towns, sleep became something more crowded. Bunkhouses gathered men into long narrow rooms, with rough bunks stacked along the walls, one above another, close enough that every turn, cough, and muttered dream belonged to everyone. Boots lined the floor, damp wool hung from pegs. The stove at the center did what it could, but never enough for all the corners at once. The upper bunks held more heat, the lower ones held more draft. No place was truly comfortable. Miners slept shoulder to shoulder under coarse blankets. Railroad men lay down still, carrying the day in their muscles, their hands cracked, their clothes heavy with smoke and iron dust. Someone snored, someone talked in his sleep, someone woke with a start, then settled again. In that kind of room, privacy disappeared quickly. But so did a certain kind of loneliness. Then there were the cowboys and riders sleeping outside, where the bed was whatever the ground allowed. Frozen earth below, blank sky above, a bedroll spread over snow-packed grass, a saddle near at hand, a small fire doing its best against an enormous dark. These men slept in their clothes too, wrapped in wool and canvas, hats low, boots close. One ear always turned toward the horse, the weather, the distance. The fire had to be watched, the wind had to be heard. A sound in the brush could mean nothing, or not nothing. So sleep came in pieces, a little while down, then awake again, a hand out toward the coals, a glance into the dark, a moment spent listening for movement, before lying back once more. The frontier produced many kinds of sleepers, but almost all of them slept lightly, incompletely, and together with fear. And still, there was comfort of a sort in shared breathing, shared nearness, shared endurance. In a family cabin, it was the warmth of those you loved. In a bunkhouse, it was the rough reassurance that others were awake when you stirred, and asleep when you finally drifted. Even out on the open ground, a tethered horse nearby, another rider not far off, or the faint answer of another campfire, somewhere in the dark, could make the night feel less empty. Hardship, when shared, did not become gentle, but it became more bearable. So when we ask how people slept at all in such winters, the answer begins to gather here. Not because the cold eased, not because the night became safe, but because exhaustion was heavy, ritual was steady, and human beings, even in fear, found ways to rest beside one another and wait for morning. By now, a clearer picture begins to form. Sleep on the frontier was not restful in the way we imagine it now. It was not deep, easy, or reliably warm. More often, it was broken, practical, and just enough. A few hours gathered here and there, a little drifting, a little waking, a little listening, and then sleep again if the fire still held and the cold had not pushed too far into the room. The body learned what the mind could not quite approve of. It learned to lie down in rough clothes, to accept hardness, to accept drafts, to accept the long companionship of winter sound. Exhaustion helped, so did habit, so did the simple fact that darkness lasted longer than waking strength could endure. However uneasy the bed, however thin the blankets, however alert, some inward part of the sleeper remained. The body still moved toward rest in the end. They slept, not because the night welcomed rest, but because the body eventually demanded it. And there was mercy in that, small though it was. For a few hours, a person did not have to chop, carry, mend, ride, lift, drag, or brace against the wind. For a few hours, even poor sleep could feel like a pause in the struggle. Not comfort exactly, not peace in full, but a brief loosening of effort, a dim place where labor stopped and morning had not yet begun. That may be the truest thing to understand about frontier sleep. It was never luxurious, and often not even satisfying. But it was enough, somehow, to carry people through one more night and into one more dawn. And if that sounds hard to imagine, let us move now toward one life in which winter sleep became almost legendary in its severity. Because there was one man on that frontier whose nights in the cold seemed to test the very edge of what a body could endure. His name was Hugh Glass, and now the story narrows. We leave the cabin, the bunkhouse, the shared pallet by the hearth, and turn toward one man whose winter nights seem to stand at the far edge of frontier endurance. Not a hero in the polished sense, not a figure arranged for legend from the beginning, but a human body pushed so far beyond ordinary safety that even sleep became something strange. Hugh Glass matters here for that reason. His story does not lead us away from the truth of frontier sleep, but deeper into it. In the settler's cabin we saw how cold, fatigue, and habit shape the night. In Glass, we find those same forces stripped of almost every protection. Less shelter, less warmth, less certainty, and yet still the body must rest somehow, even there. If the common settler showed what winter sleep usually was, Hugh Glass showed what it could become when almost everything else was stripped away. His story is a hard one, but we will move through it slowly. Not to dwell on violence for its own sake, but to notice something quieter inside it, the stubborn persistence of sleep, even in conditions that seem to leave no room for it. So let us begin where his long ordeal truly starts, with the bear, the abandonment, and the first impossible nights alone. The bear came first, sudden and absolute, in the way disaster often does in wilderness. Hugh Glass had gone ahead of the others, and entered brush that seemed empty until it was no longer empty at all. A grizzly fierce with the blind urgency of protection met him there. What followed was violent enough to alter the rest of his life, and nearly brief enough to end it. When the animal was finally driven off, Glass was left torn, broken, and scarcely recognizable as a man who could continue traveling. His companions saw what seemed obvious. He could not walk. He could hardly speak. The wilderness around them was vast, and danger moved through it constantly. 2 men were left behind to wait with him until the end came. But the end did not come quickly. Days passed. Glass remained alive, though only just, held there by some stubborn force that must have seemed almost unnatural to the men watching him. And then fear, impatience, and self-preservation did what the bear had not done. The 2 men took what they thought they needed, and left him where he lay. Alone, wounded, and without the basic protections a frontier traveler depended upon. No proper shelter, no reliable weapon, no certainty that morning would find him again. And still, night came. That is the part of his story that belongs most fully to ours. However damaged he was, however impossible his condition, he still had to face darkness. He still had to endure the old frontier requirement that every living body eventually confronts. He had to lie down somewhere. He had to drift, however unwillingly, into a little sleep. At first he could only crawl. The earth moved beneath him by inches. Grass, mud, stones, roots, the shallow edges of water. Whatever the land placed in front of him became part of the long, punishing route south. By day he dragged himself forward with a will that seemed greater than strength. By evening he had to find some slight shape of cover, a low place in the ground, a patch of brush, the lee of a bank, anything that could break the wind a little, and make the open night feel marginally less exposed. There was no bed waiting for him now, no rope frame, no straw tick, no banked fire, no wall between his body and the cold. Whatever warmth he had came from what he could gather around himself, from hide, from earth, from the diminishing labor of his own injured body. Pain was with him constantly, no longer an event but a condition. By night it changed character. It grew heavier, stranger, mingling with fever and exhaustion until waking and sleeping no longer felt entirely separate. Sometimes he lay beneath the hide he had managed to use for warmth, that rough layer between flesh and air, becoming blanket, shelter, and last defense all at once. Sometimes the stars above him were so sharp and numerous, they must have seemed almost cruel in their brightness. Sometimes clouds erased them, but always the cold settled in, first around the edges of the body, then more deeply, until night felt less like an hour than a force pressing downward. And around him, the dark remained full of life. Scavengers knew suffering when they smelled it. Coyotes moved at a distance, then nearer, then farther off again. Their voices rose in thin calls over the land, never constant, always enough. Other creatures passed through the edges of hearing. Small feet in brush, a pause in the grass, the sense, more than the sight of being surrounded by a wilderness that had not forgotten him. Glass could not answer those sounds with strength. He could only remain still and endure them, suspended between alertness and collapse. There must have been nights when sleep came in broken fragments, feverish and shallow, more like sinking than resting. A few moments gone, then a return to pain, a few moments adrift, then back again under the stars. The mind, worn thin by injury, cold and hunger, could not have moved cleanly between waking and dreaming. It must have blurred the night above, the ache within, the animal calls beyond, all of it weaving together until survival itself felt dreamlike. For Hugh Glass, sleep was not comfort, not peace, and not even rest exactly. It was the body's stubborn refusal to die. And yet, even in that ruined state, the old pattern of night remained. Cold descended, darkness widened, the sky turned brilliant overhead, the body, having done all it could do, yielded for a little while because it could do nothing else. That is one of the strangest truths in all these winter stories. Even at the edge of death, the body still seeks its brief surrender. It still takes what little absence it can. So Glass passed through those nights one by one, not master of them, not safe within them, but still moving through them toward morning. And because he did, because he kept waking, the meaning of sleep in his story begins to change. It becomes not merely another hardship, but a measure of survival itself. Which is why, when shelter finally returned to him, and walls and fire and a real bed came back into reach, that return meant more than rescue alone. It meant the possibility of true sleep again, and with it, the first real sign that he might live. At last, after all that exposure, all that crawling, all those nights spent under open sky and indifferent stars, Hugh Glass reached shelter again. A roof above him, walls that held back the wind, blankets that did not already belong to the cold. A fire tended by human hands, steady enough that he did not have to wake and fear its dying. After weeks of sleeping in pain, in weather, in hunger, in the company of scavengers and darkness, what matters here is not luxury, but contrast, a bed after bare ground, quiet after constant listening, warmth that did not have to be fought, for minute by minute. One imagines the room dim, the fire low, but faithful, the blankets heavy in the best possible way, and the body at last beginning to understand that it no longer needed to keep watch with every nerve. The great labor of vigilance which had followed him through every exposed night could finally loosen its grip. Sometimes, the deepest meaning of comfort is only felt after the body has gone without it almost completely. And so that first true sleep after ordeal feels important, not only because it was long, but because it was safe. Safe enough for pain to soften at the edges, safe enough for the body to sink more fully into stillness. Safe enough for the mind, perhaps for the first time in many nights, to stop listening for teeth in the dark or weather moving over open ground. One imagines that sleep not as luxury, but as a quiet return of the self to the body. And from that room, from that recovered breath and guarded fire, we can begin to widen our view once more. Because beyond Hugh Glass, the frontier held many stranger ways of sleeping, many rituals, beliefs, and half-understood habits by which people tried to make peace with winter nights. And if we widen the view beyond cabins and wounded trappers, another truth begins to appear. The frontier was never a blank place waiting to be understood. Long before settlers tried to sleep through its winters, Plains indigenous peoples had already learned how to rest within that cold with far greater skill, patience, and knowledge. What seemed mysterious to outsiders was often simply experience refined across generations. The tipi is a good place to begin. To unfamiliar eyes, it could look too light, too simple, too exposed for winter. But that judgment came from not knowing how carefully it worked. Its shape did not fight the wind in the way a stiff wooden wall might. It yielded to it, shed it, guided it upward. Smoke could rise through the opening above. Air could move in ways that kept the fire alive without letting the whole interior grow wild with it. The hide walls, the inner lining, the careful arrangement of space inside, all of it created a sleeping environment more intelligent than many settlers first understood. Inside, people did not simply lie down wherever there was room. Sleeping places were arranged with attention. Beds were raised from the ground on willow branches. Robes and layered materials that lifted the body away from the deepest cold below. Buffalo robes held warmth close while still breathing in a way heavy cloth often could not. Heated stones might be placed where they could give off their stored warmth slowly into the night. The position of each sleeper mattered too. Fire, air, entrance, family order, all had their place in the pattern. The people who understood winter sleep best were often those whom settlers most failed to understand. And there was more than engineering in it. Sleep was not only a bodily necessity, it could also be part of a larger spiritual order tied to dreams, direction, memory, and the unseen. The long winter night was not always treated as empty darkness to be endured. It could be approached as a time of listening, a time when dreams carried meaning, when the boundary between waking and vision felt thinner, when rest itself belonged to a larger relationship with the land and with what moved through it. Within these structures, sleep seems less like mere collapse and more like a practiced relationship with fire, air, darkness, and dream. There is something quietly beautiful in that, not easy sleep perhaps, because winter was never easy. But knowledgeable sleep, sleep shaped by skill instead of guesswork, sleep made possible by understanding how to live with the cold rather than simply defend against it. And that contrast matters, because many settlers arrived without such understanding. They entered the same winter world with thinner knowledge, rougher shelters, and a great deal of improvisation. So from this practiced wisdom, we can now turn gently toward the stranger methods that followed. The awkward, inventive, and sometimes desperate ways newcomers tried to make the night survivable. Settler winters left behind their own strange traces. Not only diary lines and weathered letters, but small objects that seem almost tender when imagined closely now. Heated stones wrapped in cloth and carried to bed like little stores of borrowed warmth. Piles of straw hollowed into sleeping pockets. Cabins sealed so tightly with rags, paper, and scraps that the air inside must have felt as weary as the people breathing it. And then there is the phrase that appears here and there in frontier writing with such calm familiarity that it is all the more unsettling: death sleep nights. A heated stone was a simple thing, and yet in winter it could feel precious. A rock warmed near the fire, then wrapped in cloth and tucked beneath blankets before bed. It would not stay warm for long, perhaps only for the first part of the night, but even that small beginning mattered. One can imagine the care in it, the choosing of the stone, the testing of its heat, the wrapping of it in worn fabric, so that it would comfort rather than burn. A poor device, perhaps, but a human one. Other methods were stranger still. In the harshest weather, some families burrowed into hay or straw, the way small animals disappear into winter grass. The straw held pockets of trapped warmth. It softened the wind. It made a kind of nest where no proper room could manage enough heat on its own. The arrangement must have been awkward, scratchy, dusty, and deeply uncomfortable by modern measure. Yet on a bitter night, discomfort was not the standard. Survival was, and then came those nights cold enough to earn a darker name. Death-sleep nights were not described with drama by the people who used the phrase. That is part of what makes it linger. They seem to mean nights when the temperature dropped so far, and the danger of sleeping too deeply became so real that families watched one another for signs of slipping too far into the cold. Blankets were piled higher, cracks were stuffed tighter, the fire was pushed as far as it safely could be. Someone stayed half awake a little longer. Someone reached out in the dark to touch a child's hand, or listen for steady breathing, or shake a shoulder just enough to make sure sleep had not gone somewhere worse. Winter frontier sleep was so extreme that people had to invent new rituals, new objects, and even new words just to live through it. And still, within all that strangeness, there was care. Someone warming a stone, someone checking the coals, someone making room in the hay, someone staying awake a little longer for the others. These acts did not make the cold merciful, but they made the night feel watched over, however imperfectly. And perhaps that is what leads us deeper now, past the objects and the phrases, toward the more elusive part of frontier sleep, the dreams people carried out of those nights. the shared strangeness of sleeping close together, and the way long darkness could begin to work upon the mind itself. As winter deepened, sleep on the frontier seems to have become something stranger than simple exhaustion. The cold was one part of it, the darkness was another, but beyond those, there was a slow change in the texture of the mind itself, as if long months of dim rooms, banked fires, and broken nights began to alter not only how people slept, but what sleep felt like from within. Dreams appear often in the traces people left behind, not always in long descriptions, but in passing remarks, in diary lines half serious and half uncertain, in the curious habit of telling dreams over breakfast, as though they belonged partly to the household, and not only to the dreamer. In cabins, camps, and bunkhouses, winter dreams could grow vivid, repetitive, and oddly communal. One person dreamed of a road through snow, another of the same pale figure walking ahead, another of a summer field that seemed impossibly real. Whether these were truly shared dreams or simply minds shaped by the same darkness, the same talk, the same fears and hopes, it is difficult to say. But the effect must have been powerful. A dream told in the morning could linger in a room, almost like weather. In bunkhouses especially, sleep itself became a shared condition. Men slept so close that no one fully belonged to his own silence. One body turned, another stirred, one man coughed, and several others half woke with him. Someone cried out from a dream, and the room held that disturbance for a few breaths before settling again. In such spaces, people learned one another's nights the way they learned one another's faces. Who snored, who muttered, who woke suddenly and listened, who slept heavily enough to worry the others. There are hints, too, of something like communal sleep-watching, not always planned, not always spoken, but felt. A drifting vigilance passing through the room, so that someone was almost always a little awake, tending the stove, turning in a blanket, listening for a change in the sound of breathing. And many did not sleep through the night in one long stretch at all. They fell into what older centuries knew well, a first sleep, then a waking, then a second sleep later on. On the frontier, this pattern may have been sharpened by winter itself. People slept early because darkness came early, then they woke in the middle hours, when the fire needed tending, or the body simply rose from sleep on its own, and they lay there listening, thinking, whispering, praying, or doing nothing at all until drowsiness returned. That middle waking was not always treated as a problem. Sometimes it was simply part of the night, a quiet interval between one surrender and the next. In those wakeful hours, the mind had room to wander. With so little light and so little outward distraction, memory and imagination must have grown unusually strong. The dark was long enough to enter, long enough to blur the edge between inward thought and dream. Some people no doubt feared that. Others perhaps grew used to it, even relied on it, letting the mind make pictures where the room offered almost none. And then there are the stranger traces left in the physical record. Small sleeping alcoves, built into walls, narrow spaces too tight for comfort, and yet carefully made. Pits dug below floor level, and lined as though someone believed the earth itself might hold a steadier temperature than the open room above. These sleeping places feel almost dreamlike now, not because they were mystical, but because they reveal how far people were willing to reshape ordinary life in order to survive an ordinary night. To modern eyes they seem peculiar, to the winter frontier they may simply have seemed worth trying. The frontier did not only change how people slept, it may have changed what sleep itself felt like, meant, and revealed to them. Perhaps that is why so many winter accounts carry a faintly altered tone, as though the writers had lived too long between cold wakefulness and vivid dream. In the long dark, the mind seems to have made its own warmth by spinning memory, dream, story, and companionship into something gentle enough to survive inside. But not everyone passed through winter under the same conditions. There were some on the frontier who seemed, at least from a distance, far better protected from such nights. And so, from these crowded rooms and dream-heavy darkness, we can turn now toward those who slept behind finer walls, under thicker blankets, and with the means to buy a different kind of winter. Not everyone on the frontier faced winter from a straw tick or a crowded bunk. There were hotel rooms in growing towns, Imported bedsteads carried west at great expense, feather mattresses, proper quilts, and fireplaces built to draw smoke cleanly upward. There were larger houses, too, with thicker walls, better windows, servants to tend fires, and enough blankets that no one had to count them before nightfall. From a distance, it might seem that wealth had solved the problem of winter sleep, and in some ways it had. A softer bed mattered, a better stove mattered, glass in the windows mattered to sleep in a room where the wind did not find every seam, where the mattress yielded instead of resisting, where warm bricks or hot water bottles might wait beneath the covers, was no small advantage. Comfort changed the odds. It made sleep deeper, longer, kinder to the body. No one living in a fine hotel room on a snowy frontier night was likely to confuse that privilege with the rough endurance of a sod house or an open camp. And yet, winter remained winter. Storms still closed roads, fuel still ran low. A well-appointed room could go cold before dawn if the fire died or the staff could not keep pace with the weather. Even in elegant houses, people woke to frozen wash basins, to breath dimly visible in the dark, to the creak of a structure answering the wind. Richer sleepers could buy protection, but they could not command the land to become gentle. There was also the deeper unease of sleeping comfortably in a harsh country. Many who had means could not entirely forget what lay beyond their walls. They knew the drivers, ranch hands, servants, miners and cooks, who slept in poorer quarters nearby. They knew that a few miles beyond town, another family might be lying awake in a drafty cabin, or that travelers on the trail might be huddled in a coach or camp, waiting for morning with far less certainty. Comfort, in such a place, could feel almost temporary, as if the frontier were merely allowing it for the night. And within fine households, inequality did not disappear simply because the sheets were better. Employers slept under feather quilts, while servants climbed to colder attic rooms or crossed yards to outbuildings where winter felt much more familiar. Wealth arranged bodies by class as carefully as it arranged furniture by taste. Some slept warm, because others rose in the night to keep the house warm for them. Still, even privilege had its limit. A blizzard could trap a private rail car as easily as a freight wagon. A mountain road could strand a wealthy traveler no less completely than a poor one. Distance had a way of humbling money. A frontier winter did not erase social difference, but it did remind everyone that darkness, cold, and uncertainty were older powers than comfort. Money could buy softer bedding and thicker walls, but it could not buy certainty against a frontier winter night. And in that shared uncertainty, rich and poor were not equal in comfort, but they were equal in one small way. Both still had to close their eyes and trust the dark. So now, with cabins and bunkhouses and open camps behind us, with Hugh Glass and dream-heavy winters, and guarded hotel rooms all passing softly into the same long history, we can begin to gather the story inward again, and return, slowly, to the warm room of the present. And so, gently, we arrive again at the rooms we have passed through tonight. The small cabins with their breathing walls, the banked fires watched with such care, the narrow beds of rope and straw, the bunkhouses full of rough breathing and restless sleep. Hugh Glass under the cold stars, yielding to darkness, because even a ruined body must sometimes yield. Hooray! The winter camps where dreams grew vivid in the long dark, the houses of the hardy, adorned, wealthy, softer and warmer, yet never fully beyond the reach of the season. All of them held together by the same quiet truth. Night kept coming, and people kept lying down inside it. If we gather all those images softly now, they begin to form something larger than hardship alone. They show us how much of human life once depended on thin shelter, fading embers, shared warmth, and stubborn endurance. They show us that sleep was not always something gentle waiting at the end of the day. Sometimes it had to be approached carefully. Sometimes it had to be prepared for like weather. Sometimes it was watched over, protected, bargained with, and entered only because the body could not continue without it. And from where you are now, that older world may feel very far away. You are likely beneath a roof that does not tremble at every gust. Your walls are thicker than theirs. Your windows keep the cold where it belongs. Your blankets are dry, Your bed receives your weight without asking you to curl around pain or brace against rising chill from the floor. If the room cools, you can answer it easily. If the night deepens, you do not have to save firewood for dawn. You do not have to wake and listen for wolves. You do not have to wonder whether the storm will find its way through the roof before morning. By frontier standards, this would have seemed almost miraculous. And perhaps that is the quiet gift hidden inside this history. The true story of winter sleep on the frontier is not only that people suffered through cold nights. It is that they kept resting against impossible odds until, slowly, and across generations, rest became easier for those who came after them. Knowledge changed, shelters improved, warmth became steadier. The long lesson of winter was learned and learned again, until what had once been fragile became ordinary. So tonight, you do not have to earn sleep in the way they did. You do not have to measure out the last sticks of wood. You do not have to keep one part of the mind awake while the other drifts. You do not have to fear the open dark in the same way. You may simply lie still and let the night hold you. That is no small thing. It is easy, in a warm room. To forget that warmth is a kind of history too. A long human history built slowly, protected carefully, passed forward, and now it is here around you, so familiar that it almost disappears into the background of life. But perhaps for a moment you can feel it again, the steadiness of the room, the kindness of the blanket, the quiet fact that your body is allowed to rest without guarding itself so fiercely. Let that be enough. Let the old cabins fade now. Let the fires sink lower. Let the snow fall farther away. You are here inside, warm, safe, no wolves to hear, no calls to tend, no roof to doubt, only the blanket, only the pillow, only your breathing. Slowly now and more slowly still, the cold is far away. The night is soft. You can let go. You can rest. You can sleep.